right, so let's do a solution. I'm going to try and follow the same process that I described earlier. So I've got a class whose name is club because I see that I'm defining the club data type. And I'm not going to put the variables first. Instead, I'm going to make method stubs. So I'll make my constructor public club. But then I notice that the constructor needs a single argument, a single input, and it looks like it's going to be the membership fee. So I'm going to have that be a double called fee. And then I'm not going to implement the body of the constructor yet. So I see I need total funds, and it says it's going to return a number that sounds like it's about funds. So I'll have a double return type, and I'll call it total funds. And then there's no input because I see I'm not supplying an input in the parentheses here. I'll need a has paid method. Oh, I've skipped add member, sorry. Okay, so let's do add member. So public void add member, and then it looks like I'll have a name as an input. I did total funds. We'll need has paid. And it looks like that's going to return true or false for whether or not somebody has paid. So the return type will be Boolean. I'll call it has paid. Oh, but then I need an input because if there's no input, how does the method know who is it that I'm supposed to look up whether or not they've paid? So I'm going to have a name for has that person paid. And then set paid, and then get unpaid list. So set paid, public void set paid, and then a name for who's paid. And then public array list string, and I'll say in a second how do we know that, for get unpaid list. So it says in the description, get unpaid list is supposed to return an array list of strings that are the names of the members who have not paid. So that's why my return type here is array list of string. And we've got get unpaid list. Okay, so now I've got the methods that define what are the things that I want to be able to do with a club object. I should be able to add members. I should be able to ask how many funds I have, ask if a member has paid. I should be able to record the fact that a member has paid, and I should get a list of everybody who's not paid. So what fields do I need? What attributes do I need to keep track of in order to do these things? So the student said, well, I'll definitely need to record what's the fee for the club. That's the input to the constructor. So I'll have private double club fee. Someone said you'll need a list of names, or they didn't say list, they said you'll need to keep track of all the names of people in the club. So we might consider doing a string of names, but the problem is, an array of names, but the problem with that is I don't know how many names there are going to be because people can keep adding to the club. And an array, you have to tell it the exact size you want it to be when you first create it, and you can't make it larger or smaller. So an array is a bad choice for this implementation. Instead, let's use an array list, because an array list you can add and remove items from the list. So names. Very important that we're not going to give these attributes their starting values. We're not going to initialize them, because that's the job of the constructor. So in the constructor, another important thing is, just because I have two attributes, I don't have to take two inputs to my constructor. I would do this if when I make the club, I want to start the club with a fee and a list of people who are already in it. If you look at the problem specification, the constructor doesn't take a second input. So I wouldn't want to have this second input here. The constructor only takes a single input that's the fee. So I'll say club fee equals fee. And then I still need to create the names list, but I'll just do it here, and I won't have any names to start with. So it just creates an empty list. Okay, so we've got the constructor. So I'm not ready to start adding things yet because there's one thing that I don't know how to do. I've recorded everybody who's in the club, but I don't have any way of keeping track of who's paid yet. So there's a couple things you could do. One thing you could do is you could just have another list of names called members who paid. And so whenever a member pays, I'll just add their name to the list. A different thing we could do is we could have a list of Boolean values, and these lists could be the same length. So paid status. So the idea here is whenever we would add a name to the names list, we would also add a Boolean value to the paid status. So if I add the name Bilbo, at the same time I would add false here. And then if I add another name, Frodo, I would also add false for Frodo. So these lists are supposed to be kept in parallel. So like element 1 or like index 1 in this list corresponds to index 1 in that list. So it's got a name and whether or not they've paid. And then later on, if we need to set that a certain person has paid, we can loop through this list until we find their name. We remember what location did that happen. So we remember, oh, we found Frodo at index 1. And then you can change index 1 in the other list to be true as a way of recording that Frodo has paid. So all of this is imagining work. See how I haven't written any code yet? This is exactly what you would actually do if you were solving this problem. You need to solve the entire problem in your mind, or maybe not the entire problem, but you have to solve most of the problem in your mind before you start writing the methods, because you need to be sure that you have a plan for how are you going to keep track of all the information you need in order to answer these kinds of questions and do these kinds of things. Okay, let's solve it twice. I'm going to solve it first this way, and then we'll solve it the other way. So now that I have paid status, I'll have paid status equals new array list. So when I'm going to add a member, I'm going to need to actually add two things. I'll say names.addName, which will take the input name and store it in the list of all names. And I will also have paid status.addFalse. Whenever I add, it adds to the end of the list. So I'm going to add a new name to the end of the list, and when we first add them, they haven't paid anything yet, so I'll add false to the end of the list. If you're thinking, hey, wait a minute, how do we know that the same name hasn't been added twice? That's a good thing to note. And let's actually make a to-do comment to remember this. To-do check if name has already been added. So it's like a little reminder to ourselves. Okay, total funds, let's come back to that one. Let's do has paid. So for has paid, we'd loop over the names until we find one, and then we'd look up the corresponding status. So I'm going to have a for loop where I loop up to names.size, oops. And then I'll say, names.size. And what I'm looking for is I'm looking for whether name equals names.getI. If this is a lot to look at all at once, we could break it out. So we could say string name equals, or let's call it name to check equals names.getI. And then we could say if the name we're looking for equals the name to check, then we found it. So if we found it, what we want to do is we want to remember, or I guess we can just return right away. If we find it, we can return their paid status. So we'll look up paid status and we'll get location I. Because location I was where we found our name in the names list. So location I is also where we're going to find whether or not they paid. Because remember, the lists were sort of parallel lists. But we still have to remember what happens if we're searching for a member who has never been added to the list at all. So if we get to the end of the for loop and we've never found the name we're looking for, let's return false because that member has never paid. So I decided what to return by asking myself, what's this method supposed to do? What's it called? And then I'd think, what would make sense as a return value if I reach this point in the code? And at this point in the code, I've already checked all the names. So it's like this name is just not part of our club. So, of course they haven't paid yet. So I'll return false. Okay, let's do set paid. Set paid should be very similar. I'm going to loop through all the names. I'm going to get each name that I want to check. If I find the name that's the one I want to check, then instead of returning the paid status, I'm going to say paid status dot set location I to true. You might not have remembered that set is a thing you can do with array lists, and in that case, that's okay. Setting the array list to true is exactly the same thing as doing the following in an array. If I'd said paid status I equals true, this is saving the value true into location I, and it's going to replace whatever used to be there. It's going to overwrite the old value. So this does the exact same thing. I am going to overwrite the old value at location I with this new value of true. Let's do total funds. So for total funds, I think I want to loop over, like let me think about how I would calculate this. It's like the number of people who paid times the fee. Like that's how much money we have overall. So it's like I've got to figure out how many people have paid. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to loop over paid status, and I'm going to say if paid status element I is true, that means it's one more person who's paid. So I'm going to increment a counter for how many people have paid. So int count equals 0. And then at the end, I'll just return that counter times whatever the club fee is. So that would be a pretty direct way of calculating the total funds. Okay, last one. Let's do get unpaid list. So here I'm going to have to create an array list of string, which will be called like in trouble, because these are the people who are in trouble because they haven't paid. And the reason I need to do this is because I know I'm going to return a list, and so I need to make a new list and then add people to it because I'm going to figure out who hasn't paid yet. So I'm going to do a similar thing where I'm going to loop over paid status, and I'm going to find all the people who haven't paid. So let's say paid status.getElementI, and I'm going to save it into a variable paid. And now I'm going to say if it is not true that that person's paid, then what I want to do is I want to get their name. I want to know, who are you? So I'm going to get the names list, element I, and then I'm going to add them to the in trouble list. So I'm going to say in trouble add name. So I get the status if they haven't paid. This is just a way of saying if paid equals false. You could do either way. Then I will get the name of the person and add it to the list of people who are in trouble. And then at the very end, I will return the list of people who are in trouble. Okay, so some of these methods turned out to be a little bit trickier than we thought they would be. We still haven't done this. Let's try and solve this all one more time, but let's use the other data representation, because this is a good lesson that how you represent your data can really affect how easy it is to implement a solution. Okay, so now I've got a list of names, that's just who's in the club, and I've got another list of people who have paid. And so now I've got my constructor where I initialize all of the attributes. And so now when I'm going to add a member, I'm going to add their name to the members list, but I'm not going to record paid status because by default, nobody's paid. I only record who's paid when they pay. Let's go down to, here, let's make all of these be empty. So set paid. If I want to set that someone's paid, now I've got who paid, and I'm just going to add their name to the paid list. So that part has become much easier. Let's see, how can we check if someone's paid? So in that case, we could do it the long way or the short way. Here's the long way. The long way is let's loop through the list and find it. I'm going to use a for each loop this time. So who, and I'm going to look at who paid. So remember, the way a for each loop works is each member of the list gets assigned to this variable one loop at a time. So I want to check to see if the name I'm looking for equals that particular person. And if the answer is yes, that means they're in the who paid list. And so I can return true. Otherwise, if I get to the end and I've never returned true, that means I never found them in my list, so I'd return false. So that will work. For people who are thinking, wait a minute, array lists have a contains method. This is silly. You're right, this is silly. So I could say if, what's it called? If who paid dot contains name. And that does the loop for us. This literally does what it sounds like. I'm checking to see if this thing is inside this list. Then I could return true. Otherwise, I could return false. But this is exactly the same pattern in the last solution. I don't even need to do this. Really, I just want to know, is this thing going to be true or false? So I'm just going to return the status of that. This is going to evaluate to be true or false, and that's exactly what I want to return. So far, this is coming out to be a lot simpler than the other approach. Let's do total funds. Total funds, we said, is just the fee times the number of people who paid. And this is also much easier. I can do club fee times, but then the number of people who paid is just the size of the paid list. So this has also ended up much easier. Okay, so one more left, get unpaid list. So this is the only one that's turned out to be more difficult. So what I have to do is I have to figure out, are there any names in this list that are not in that list? Even this is not so bad though. So I'm going to use a for each loop again. So I'm going to do name to check and then the names list. So each element in names is going to get assigned to this name to check. And then I want to ask the question, is the name to check inside the paid list? So I'm going to have who paid dot contains name to check. And if that equals false, that means it's not in the list. And so then I would want to take that name and add them to the list of people who are in trouble. So even that's not so bad if you already know about contains. So I check each name. I say, is that name in the list of people who paid? If the answer is no, then they haven't paid. And so I'm going to add that same name to the list of people in trouble. If you're wondering why IntelliJ is highlighting this line, it's because it's not conventional to say equals false. You would usually say if it is not true that the paid list contains the name, then I would do the other thing. Okay, I hope this was helpful. If you learned things from this process, let's do this. Check if name has already been added. So I'll do this. I'll say if names already contains name, then I'll just return right away and don't do anything. So this is a way of seeing, does my list of all the names already have the name I'm trying to add? And if it does, I won't do anything. I'll exit right away. Otherwise, I'll add it to the list. And I would probably want to do that for has paid also. So let's say if who paid contains name, then I'll, not has paid, set paid. Because I don't want to set the same person as having paid multiple times. So I would say if who paid contains name, then return false. Nope, then don't return anything. I'll just return right away because I don't want to add them to the list of people who paid because they've already paid. Okay, I hope this has been helpful. If you didn't do this the first time around, that's okay. That's what learning's about. You might try to do a rapid redo where you spend 10 minutes doing something else, come back and try and implement this yourself based on your memory of the patterns and based on your memory of how it makes sense. Don't try to memorize individual lines. You want to try and remember, how does this object make sense? How do you organize the information? And then once you have the information, how does it make sense to access that information?